I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Band of Brothers, the Jesuits. Trivia question time. What do the philosophers René Descartes, Voltaire, the Marquis de Condorcet, Denis Diderot, Giambattista Vico, and Michel Foucault all have in common? It would be a hard question if you didn't already know the title of this episode, but thanks to that hint, perhaps you've already guessed the right answer, namely that they all attended educational institutions run by the Jesuits. The founding of schools was not part of the initial plan when Ignatius of Loyola and a handful of followers started the order, but it soon became central to their mission. The first college was founded in Messina in 1548, with the Roman College following soon after. Over the next couple of centuries, more than 800 schools would be founded all over the world, especially in Europe, of course, but also in the Americas and Asia. One of them was the Collège of La Flèche, where Descartes began his studies at the tender age of 10 and remained for almost a decade. In other words, his most formative years were spent studying with the Jesuits. He cut his teeth on Jesuit authors of the Counter-Reformation period, like Francisco de Toledo, Pedro de Fonseca, and the Aristotelian commentators of the Portuguese city of Coimbra. We think of Descartes as a pivotal figure who broke with the philosophy of the past, and in his discourse on the method, he did complain about the conservative education he had received from the Jesuits. Yet in a letter, he recommended La Flèche as the best place on earth to study philosophy. He also asserted the compatibility of his own thought with the theological commitments of the Jesuits, stating that his own philosophy was not new, but the oldest and most common of all, and in agreement with the principles of Aristotle, which sounds pretty Jesuit to me. In fact, I can't help being struck by a parallel between Ignatius of Loyola's writings and the most famous work of Descartes, which is, of course, his Meditations. That treatise is a paradigm of rationalist philosophy in which even our most basic assumptions and beliefs are subjected to radical doubt, only to be restored through a sequence of argument that begins with "I think, therefore I am," and ends by confirming our confidence in the reality of the external world. Loyola never wrote anything quite like this, but his writings do encourage an inward turn, an attempt to discover truth in the private recesses of the individual mind. Perhaps then, Jesuit intellectual culture links Descartes not only to the scholastics of 16th century Iberia, but also to the religious literature of that period and the interiority that characterized the writings of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Loyola himself. Like John, Loyola drew on both scholasticism and spiritualism. He had a thorough education in Aristotelian philosophy, attending universities at Alcalá, Salamanca, and Paris from 1526 to 1535. But a heartfelt spirituality was already part of his thought too, going back to 1521, when he read chivalric romances and religious texts while recuperating from a war wound. This turned him away from his previous path as an aristocratic knight and towards becoming a so-called soldier of Christ. If that phrasing calls to mind Erasmus's Handbook of the Christian Soldier, Loyola's conversion experience has even more striking parallels with Teresa of Avila, who had a similar brush with death and similar reading habits. The results were similar too. Like her, Loyola had mystical, or at least intense contemplative, experiences. He once told a colleague, "I was a moment ago higher than the sky," and would claim that he had enjoyed visions that conveyed to him directly all the truths about God to be found in Scripture. As Teresa would do, Loyola wrote about his own life and offered detailed recommendations for the religious life. Most significant here are the spiritual exercises, a kind of how-to guide for those who want to make progress in the faith. It's more a text to be used than one to be read, as it lays out steps for private meditation and inward reflection, for example, when facing difficult choices like whether to commit to a religious life over a worldly one. In fact, it may better be seen as a teacher's manual, insofar as the advice would be useful for someone offering spiritual direction to someone else, as Teresa's various confessors did with her. If all goes well, the process will turn the believer away from the created world and towards God. Loyola goes so far as to pray for the gift of hatred against the world. But in more moderate moments, he sounds more like an ancient Stoic, recommending that we treat worldly things like wealth, honor, or longevity as matters of indifference. In other words, none of these things should be desired more than others. All that matters is obedience to the will of God. Obedience was indeed one of the Jesuits' favorite words. They were ostentatious in obeying not only God, but also his representative on earth the Pope. All members of the order took a vow of obedience to him and were enjoined to show as little resistance to his instructions as a corpse would. If the church were to say that what seems white is in fact black, then a Jesuit should agree. This attitude of deference justifies the traditional association between the Jesuits and the Counter-Reformation. As modern-day scholar Silvia Mostaccio has put it, the entire project of the society, as Ignatius and his first companions envisioned it, is built around the constitutive tension between construction of the individual conscience and obedience to superiors. Not long after Loyola's death in 1556, he was already being hailed as Catholicism's answer to Martin Luther, and the Jesuits were indeed furious opponents of the Protestant movement. As the Jesuit Diego Lainez proclaimed, they would fervently embrace all that the Lutherans rejected, praying the rosary, confessing their sins, saying prayers for the dead, and even respecting the indulgences issued by the Church. But it would be an exaggeration to say that the Jesuits were founded specifically to combat the Reformation. Another historian of the order, John O'Malley, has pointed out that when the early group around Loyola took an oath to undertake a ministry abroad in 1534, they set their eyes on Jerusalem, not Wittenberg. Actually, the church hierarchy was at first suspicious of Loyola. His mystical, individualist, and interior approach to spirituality reminded them uncomfortably of the excesses of the Alumbrados, an association that Loyola vigorously denied. Gradually, though, they did receive the papacy's support. After the order was approved in 1540, an initial restriction was placed on the number of members, but this was lifted in 1543. 2 years later, they were freed from local oversight by bishops and put directly under the authority of the Pope. By the time of Loyola's death, there were about 1,000 members. By the end of the 16th century, this would reach 5,000 and 22,000 at the height of the order in 1640. The low point would come in 1773, when the papacy would ban the order in response to widespread opposition to their political influence, among other factors. But you can't keep a good religious order down. The Jesuits would be restored in 1814 and get back to their worldwide program of educating Christian youth. If Loyola was more or less literally the patron saint of this movement as a whole, then the man who epitomized its global aspect was Francis Xavier. He opened up new territories for the order, especially in Asia, setting the stage for other Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricci. Xavier arrived in India in 1542. He stopped in Kenya and Mozambique on the way, but the Jesuits really got going in Africa only later that decade. In India, Xavier extracted permission for the building of a church from the great Mughal emperor Akbar. He then moved on to Japan and was mightily impressed by what he found there, famously remarking that these were the best of the peoples yet discovered as the Europeans spread out across the globe. A similar assessment was provided by José de Acosta, another intrepid Jesuit who crossed the seas in the other direction. After years of asking to be sent to the Americas, he was finally allowed to go on mission there in 1571. Like Bartolomé de las Casas, he was convinced that the Amerindians could be won over to the true faith. Those who had found them mentally inadequate were themselves to blame, since, for a bad teacher, all disciples are stupid. Still, he happily conceded that the stage of civilization found in the Americas was far inferior to that in Europe, with the cultures of Asia in the middle. He offered an ingenious explanation for this supposed fact in the context of trying to explain how human beings had wound up living in the Americas in the first place, given that all humans, apart from the descendants of Noah, should have been wiped out in the biblical flood. They must, proposed Acosta, have come across a land bridge from Asia. The more advanced societies are those closer to the cradle of humanity, with civilization having degraded as it traveled from Europe and the Middle East, across Asia and finally to the Americas. But for Acosta, this was good news when it came to the Amerindians. Their inferiority was simply a matter of socialization, not an irreversible feature of their bodies or the places where they lived. As Acosta put it, the incapacity of their minds, the ferocity of their customs, does not derive from natural inclination or from the effect of climate, so much as from a prolonged education and customs, like those of the beast. Alongside the objectionable hierarchical thinking, this account is remarkable for its naturalistic, one might say scientific, strategy of explanation. And that fits with Acosta's output more generally. He wrote a Natural and Moral History of the Indies, which we already discussed in episode 440. There, we looked at him in the context of the empirical research that went along with global exploration. He's certainly part of that story, but no less does he fit into the story of the Jesuits. His history was intended to accompany his writings on missionary work, and his approach to nature came with pious caveats. It is God who allows humankind to make new discoveries when the time comes, a prime example being the development of compass technology, when it was foreordained that European Christians should begin to spread their religion to the New World. Reflecting on contemporary attempts to explain the behavior of the compass needle, which we looked at in episode 435 on magnetism, Acosta was skeptical. There is not a philosopher or cosmographer who knows it. As we saw, Acosta did hope to find causal explanations, and even criticized authors who didn't make the effort to do so, but he believed that human knowledge is severely limited and achieved only when God sees fit. More generally, it would be fair to say that the Jesuits tended to be conservative when it came to updating Aristotelian science in the light of new findings. The order's regulations stipulated that at the colleges, the doctrine of Aristotle should be followed in logic, natural and moral philosophy, and metaphysics, as also the other liberal arts. Though instructors should also warn students about Aristotelian teachings that conflicted with those of the Church. One member of the order put the general policy this way: one should not be drawn to new opinions, that is, those which one has discovered, but one should adhere to the old and generally accepted opinions. Particularly well known is the order's rejection of the new Copernican astronomy, which seems to go hand in hand with the Church's condemnation of that theory in 1616. But before we give the Jesuits too hard a time about this, we should bear in mind that it took a long while for astronomers around Europe, of all religious denominations, to warm up to the heliocentric system. Nor were Jesuits simply uninterested in heliocentrism or incapable of engaging with it scientifically. Exploiting their far-flung network of missions, they made astronomical observations on a global scale, for example, when they recorded the sighting of the same comet in 1618 all over the world, including in India, Vietnam, and China. Rather than adhering to the ancient system of Aristotle and Ptolemy, with the Earth in the center being orbited by the visible heavenly bodies, some Jesuits agreed with the theory of Tycho Brahe. As you'll remember, Brahe had the Earth unmoving and the Sun going around it, but some planets then moving around the Sun. The Jesuit Cristoforo Bori even accepted the idea of a fluid heaven, which, as we saw, was postulated to explain how comets could move unimpeded through the realm of the planets. Here, though, he was the exception that proved the Jesuits' conservative rules, since after this daring assertion, he was disciplined by the order and sent packing to Asia. When it came to pure mathematics, the Jesuits were somewhat more innovative. The leading figure here is Christopher Clavius, who established his name by working on reform of the calendar, something that, of course, involved considerable astronomical competence. Clavius taught at Rome and set up an academy there for the study of mathematics. In the usual mode of humanizing scholasticism, they commented on classical texts but also produced textbooks for the various mathematical subdisciplines. What Clavius did not do, or not much at least, was to investigate applied mathematical arts like mechanics. This may have been due to methodological scruples. He saw mathematics as a study of purely abstract quantities, not of quantities as realized in concrete things, like falling bodies or projectiles. This makes for an obvious contrast with Galileo, who did such pioneering work on floating and falling bodies. Yet it has also been argued that Galileo's early writings, especially some notebooks which were not published at the time, show the impact of lectures he attended in Pisa, which were given by Jesuits. So the Jesuits were, unlike the posture of your average teenage boy, no slouches when it came to science. But it was in ethics that they made their most indelible mark on the history of philosophy. I have in mind the controversial doctrine called mental reservation. It was an idea they developed while pursuing the practice you may associate with the Jesuits more than anything else, namely casuistry. As the name implies, casuistry is moral reasoning about specific cases, which might often be hypothetical but could have direct application, as when facing the moral quandaries that could arise in the context of taking confession. Books were written to offer guidance in such matters, like Francisco de Toledo's Instruction for Priests, and Jesuit confessors were advised to spend an hour a day considering different cases and how they should be handled. Before we get to mental reservation, we should notice that the development of casuistry marks an interesting moment in the history of ethics. Certainly, earlier moral philosophers had occasionally considered difficult cases, genuine ethical dilemmas where it was simply unclear what was right. But Aristotle and many subsequent authors were mostly interested in topics like the nature of virtue, or the question of how political regimes could encourage virtue. Indeed, Aristotle himself has almost nothing to say about moral dilemmas. He seems to have thought that there is little the moral philosopher can say about hard cases, but that this is not a problem because the virtuous person will simply know what to do. It's arguably only with the Jesuits and their science of casuistry that dilemmas take center stage as a central topic for moral theorizing. They saw that even trained moral reasoners with good intentions may be genuinely torn when they are faced with clashing ethical imperatives. Today's moral philosophers are in this respect heirs to the Jesuits. They like to think about things like whether you should divert a trolley to a different track to save 50 people who are about to be run over at the cost of killing the 10 people in the trolley. The clash that led the Jesuits to devise the idea of mental reservation was more realistic than that. They were worried about situations where there's a good moral reason not to tell the truth. Of course, the dilemma arises because there's also a general moral rule against lying. Imagine, for instance, that a priest has learned in confessional that a parishioner committed murder and is then asked about it by the police. He's bound by the seal of the confession, so he cannot say that the man is guilty, but neither would he want to say that the man is innocent, since that would be a lie. You might wonder, can't he just refuse to speak at all? Well, yes, but we can assume that the police would take this to mean that the parishioner confessed the crime to the priest, making the dilemma inescapable. So, what to do? The advice some Jesuits gave was to say aloud, "He did not tell me," and then continue the sentence, but only in the mind, at least not in such a way that I could report it to you. Another all-too-real context in which mental reservation became relevant was in Protestant countries, especially England, where Jesuits were infiltrating to support the cause of Catholics. This was a covert operation, something that required a good deal of deception, and here the strategy of mental reservation came in handy. For instance, the Jesuit propagandist Robert Persons said that a Catholic hiding a priest might say to the authorities, "There is no priest in my house," and then add in thought, "who I am bound to report to you." A similar real-life case was that of an English Catholic who was interrogated and said he was not a priest, and then thought to himself, "Of Apollo." When Jesuits who were put on trial in England were found to have used this technique, which was also called dissimulation, it became infamous. It helped the word casuistry itself to acquire the connotation of sneaky moral reasoning used to rationalize wicked actions. At the time, mental reservation was subjected to the inevitable result that it seemed rather Machiavellian, but philosophically speaking, mental reservation is well worth our attention. It is clearly not just lying and pretending to yourself that you're not lying, nor should it be confused with the idea that we are allowed to lie in some circumstances, committing a smaller evil to avoid a larger one. That solution was actually proposed at the time as an alternative to mental reservation, as was the equally straightforward idea that if an evil inquisitor is questioning you, you are under no obligation to tell the truth anyway. Mental reservation is more sophisticated and more interesting. The proposal is that an assertion is normally just whatever one says out loud, but it can be made up of more than one part, and not every part has to be spoken. A nice example that was given was this. A dying man is saying who should inherit his property, and says, "And to the church I leave 1,000, and then his voice gives out, such is his weakened state. So he points to some gold coins, completing the intended meaning. In the same way, a mental reservation or caveat can be part of what is stated. Now, according to a standard definition given by the Jesuit Francisco de Toledo, a lie is a false statement intended to deceive, or better, a statement intended to deceive that the speaker believes to be false. When the Catholic said he was not a priest and then thought of Apollo, that second part makes the statement true. He wasn't a priest of Apollo. It may be intended to deceive, but it's not a lie. This is frightfully clever, but it raises obvious worries. After all, with truths like this, who needs lies? Suppose you and I are making a business agreement, and I say, "I will pay you on time," with the mental caveat, "if I feel like it," or "if I happen to win the lottery." If people started to do this regularly, then the whole practice of making contracts would collapse. For this reason, some defenders of mental reservation stipulated that it should not be used in contexts where utterances are binding, as in promises, but that seems rather ad hoc. More generally, the doctrine was open to the charge that it would undermine the very purpose of language, which is to communicate. Pointing at a coin is a public act and suffices for communication, but mental additions are private and communicate nothing, so they cannot be part of language. That seems to me a good criticism, But it should be borne in mind that the Jesuits who defended dissimulation were not saying that anyone can add mental reservations to anything they say. The intent is still to deceive, and deception can be sinful or not, depending on whether the victim has it coming to them. Perhaps we could think of using mental reservation to deceive an unjust interrogator as being akin to committing an act of violence in self-defense. In light of this, mental reservation could be sinful, but it depends on the situation, whereas lying is always sinful. The way the Jesuits approached this issue is characteristic in that they treated it fundamentally as a question about the philosophy of language. As you'll remember from our series on medieval philosophy, technical issues of logic and language had long been a mainstay of scholastic philosophy, and the Jesuits were thoroughly trained in that tradition. They looked back to one scholastic thinker in particular, Thomas Aquinas. While it was not absolutely forbidden to depart from his teachings, he was considered a special teacher, already picked out for special reverence by Loyola himself. In due course, the order would declare that instructors at the Jesuit schools must follow absolutely the doctrine of St. Thomas in scholastic theology, and they must consider him one of us, and that one is never to talk of St. Thomas without honoring him, following him willingly whenever possible. One is to depart from him with reverence and reluctance. Nor were the Jesuits the only Catholic intellectuals looking to Aquinas in this period. While never less than a major figure, he was now coming to occupy the central role among medieval philosophers that he still has today. How and why did this happen? Well, why not make a mental reservation to find out by joining me next time on the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.